Davenport native and American Pickers star Frank Fritz has died. He did suffer a stroke back in 2022, and his close friend tells us he had been working hard to rehabilitate but faced many setbacks on his road to recovery.
When Frank Fritz was fired from American Pickers in March 2020, fans were left shocked and stunned. But no one could have predicted that this event would be just the first step in a series of chilling mysteries. By September 2024, news of his death not only saddened the antique-loving community, but also sparked an unexpected controversy. This is because what was hidden in Frank's home was not just valuable antiques, but also things that left everyone in a state of uneasy silence. Secret documents, an unfinished will with cryptic phrases and items that had never been made public, have raised a troubling question. Was Frank Fritz, a man celebrated as a legend in the world of collecting, hiding a dark secret? Did Frank keep things he was willing to carry with him throughout his life and take to the grave? Let's unravel these mysteries in today's video. 1. The life and legacy of Frank Fritz. Before we delve into the shocking discoveries, let's take a moment to remember Frank Fritz, one of the most passionate collectors the world has ever known, who dedicated his entire life to hunting, preserving and cherishing the historical stories he believed should never be forgotten. Frank Fritz was not a man born into the bright spotlight of fame. He grew up in Davenport, Iowa on October 11, 1963, in an ordinary family. However, from a very young age, Frank displayed a special passion, an endless curiosity about old, forgotten objects. While other kids were engrossed in baseball games or the latest comic books, Frank would spend hours examining the small items that others often considered trash. A rusted beer can, an old stamp, or even used razor blades. To Frank, all of these were pieces of history stories waiting to be discovered. This passion was not simply a childhood hobby. It grew over time, becoming an inseparable part of his life. As he matured, Frank began to expand the scope of his collection. Small items like stamps and beer cans were gradually replaced by larger, more valuable items: vintage motorcycles, rare memorabilia, and objects with special historical significance. He would spend hours wandering flea markets, auctions, and old warehouses. For Frank, each item was not just an object. It was a story, a piece of the past that he wanted to preserve. However, Frank's life did not start with the dusty adventures of a professional antique hunter. Before becoming a familiar face on television, Frank spent nearly 25 years as a firefighter in Iowa. It was a job that required seriousness, focus, and a keen eye, skills he later brought into the world of collecting. During his years as a firefighter, Frank often had the opportunity to access old buildings, abandoned warehouses, places where he discovered hidden treasures. From scorched firefighter helmets and antique fire alarms to fire extinguishers that had been around for decades, Frank saw them as precious pieces of the fire history puzzle. This passion eventually turned into a career. What started as a personal hobby soon led Frank to realize that the items he found were not only valuable for their sentimental worth, but also had commercial value. He began to buy and sell them, turning his passion into a small business. His first shop, called Frank's Finds, was a modest but bold step. There, he specialized in selling antiques, particularly those related to firefighting and the rare items he discovered on his travels. However, Frank's life changed completely when he met Mike Wolfe, a fellow enthusiast with the same passion for collecting antiques. The two quickly realized that they shared a deep love for antique items and the stories behind them. Although they did not start out as close friends, their collaboration laid the foundation for a groundbreaking reality television show, American Pickers. Mike Wolfe, with his big vision, recognized that antique hunting wasn't just a hobby. It could become a lifestyle, even a cultural phenomenon. Frank, with his genuine personality and excellent communication skills, became the perfect companion to bring Mike's idea to life. When American Pickers premiered on the History Channel in 2010, the show quickly became a phenomenon. Over 3 to 1 million people watched the first episode, and the show achieved tremendous success. But what made the show so captivating wasn't just the valuable antiques they found. but also the friendship and genuine interactions between Frank and Mike. Viewers loved Frank for his honesty, humorous personality, and his unreserved passion. His skillful negotiation and the way he told the stories behind each item created a special charm, making him an indispensable character on the show. However, the fame that came with success also brought immense pressure. Frank had to face serious issues that few could ever imagine. 2. Behind the spotlight. Frank's health issues were one of the major factors that led to profound changes in his life. Frank suffered from Crohn's disease, a chronic condition that causes inflammation in the digestive tract, gradually deteriorating his health over time. This is an incredibly uncomfortable illness. People with Crohn's disease face prolonged periods of pain, exhaustion, and digestive disorders, all of which severely affect the quality of life. For Frank, Crohn's disease was not just a physical challenge, but also a psychological burden. Although he tried to maintain an optimistic spirit in front of the cameras, sharp-eyed viewers could still notice significant changes in his appearance from season to season. Frank steadily lost weight, which was the most apparent sign that his health was getting worse. His health condition worsened even further when he had to undergo major back surgery. This was no simple procedure. It was a large operation that involved 185 stitches and 2 metal rods being implanted into his spine. These injuries left Frank with a lengthy and painful recovery process. During this period, he could not continue participating in the show, and his absence raised many questions from the fans. However, behind the scenes, Frank was not only battling illness, but also struggling with feelings of isolation and pressure from life under the spotlight. The pressure of fame was another factor that made Frank's life even heavier. While American Pickers brought him fame and affection from millions of viewers, the price of fame was far from comfortable. Frank was no longer a regular man who could live freely. Every time he appeared in public, he attracted attention with the expectation that he would always be cheerful and humorous, just like his on-screen persona. However, behind those smiles were enormous mental pressures. Frank admitted that fame had caused him anxiety and made it difficult for him to balance his work and personal life. He not only had to contend with illness, but also had to maintain the image of a passionate antique hunter full of energy in the eyes of the public. These personal pressures and difficulties contributed to the rift in the relationship between Frank and Mike Wolfe, who had been his companion for over a decade on American Pickers. To the fans, Frank and Mike were not just colleagues, but close friends. However, the reality of their relationship was far from perfect, as it appeared on screen. After Frank had to temporarily leave the show to treat his illness and recover from surgery, he felt abandoned by Mike. According to Frank, during his recovery, Mike never reached out to check on him or offer encouragement. This made Frank feel that their relationship existed only for the benefit of the show, not as a true friendship, as the viewers had believed. In 2021, the show officially announced that Frank would not return to American Pickers. This was a shock to the fans who were used to seeing Frank and Mike traveling together, uncovering forgotten treasures. But for Frank, this decision was even more painful. He felt like he had been pushed out of the show that he had helped build from the very beginning. The rift between Frank and Mike not only shattered a long-lasting friendship, but also closed an important chapter in Frank's life. After leaving American Pickers, Frank Fritz no longer appeared on television. However, this did not mean he had given up on his passion. In fact, Frank transitioned into online business, utilizing social media platforms to connect with the antique-loving community he had always cherished. He continued to sell collectibles through websites and shared knowledge about antiques, particularly vintage motorcycles, the greatest passion of his life. Frank also wrote books about the antiques trade, inspiring those passionate about the field. Although he was no longer on screen, he remained dedicated to his love and enthusiasm for the work he had pursued throughout his life. However, in July 2022, a major event occurred when Frank suffered a severe stroke at his home in Davenport, Iowa. This stroke left him unable to care for himself. Frank was rushed to the hospital in critical condition and later transferred to a rehabilitation center. The treatment costs which amounted to $29,000 per month, forced his family to seek legal assistance. A court appointed a guardian to take care of his daily needs, as well as a bank to manage his finances. For Frank, a man who had always lived with a sense of freedom and independence, having to rely on others was a severe shock. However, during this difficult period, a miracle occurred. The friendship between Frank and Mike Wolfe was repaired. After years of distance and misunderstanding, Frank requested to meet Mike. Their reunion was a deeply emotional moment. The two men, once close partners, now sat together, putting aside any past grievances. Mike told Frank that no one could replace him, and that he had always valued him despite everything that had happened. This meeting not only provided comfort to both men, but also showed that no matter how many misunderstandings and conflicts there are, true friendship will always find a way to overcome them. Frank's final words before he passed away in September 2024 said it all. The past never truly disappears. It is always with us. For Frank, the most important thing was not what happened in the past, but how we learn to reconcile and find meaning in the present. Frank Fritz's life is a story of passion, dedication, and constant challenges. However, what makes his story even more special is what was discovered after his death. An extensive and surprising collection of antiques full of emotion that even his closest loved ones never anticipated. This was the moment when his story turned to a new page, a new dramatic and emotional chapter in Frank Fritz's life. 3. Shocking discoveries in Frank Fritz's estate. When Frank Fritz passed away in September 2024, his closest loved ones, from family to friends, felt a deep sense of loss. However, none of them were prepared for what would unfold afterward. When his estate doors were opened, a completely new world emerged, a space filled with precious antiques, rare motorcycle collections, and items that even the most seasoned collectors would admire. This was not just an ordinary collection. It was an entire part of Frank's life, carefully preserved in every item, every detail, no matter how small. It was discovered that Frank Fritz owned an astonishingly vast collection of vintage motorcycles, almost unbelievable in its size. These motorcycles were not merely transportation. They were true jewels in the history of motorcycling. Among them were extremely rare models from famous brands such as Indian Motorcycles, Harley-Davidson, as well as custom choppers that Frank spent decades collecting. Some of the bikes were preserved in perfect condition, shining under the lights as if Frank had just polished them yesterday. But there were also bikes that were still in incomplete states, covered in dust, like projects he hadn't had the chance to finish before passing. These motorcycles not only reflected Frank's deep passion for vintage bikes, but also symbolized his perseverance and the respect he had for each piece. However, the motorcycles were not the only items Frank's estate also contained. Hundreds of other antiques, from vintage signs and memorabilia to items linked to the history of the United States. Old advertising signs, classic gas pumps, and metal toys from the 1950s were all meticulously arranged, as if Frank had spent his whole life protecting and cherishing them. Each item told its own story, a part of the past that Frank had worked tirelessly to preserve. To him, these weren't just inanimate objects, but fragments of history, living documents of eras gone by. What made this discovery even more remarkable was how Frank built his collection. He was not a wealthy collector with abundant financial resources. Instead, he was an ordinary man who spent his life roaming flea markets, old warehouses, and the hidden corners of America, searching for items others might dismiss as worthless. Every item in his collection bore Frank's mark, from how he found them to how he bargained to acquire them to how he restored and cherished them. This collection was not only a reflection of his passion, but also a story of dedication, a story of how he lived and worked with a deep love for the past. However, what truly moved everyone was the profound meaning these items held. They were not just material possessions. They were a legacy of a man who dedicated his life to finding and protecting the stories of the past. Frank was not only a collector, he was a storyteller, a historian. The items he left behind were proof of how he viewed the world, a world filled with stories waiting to be discovered, and treasures needing to be valued. When Frank's family and friends began to go through the items in his estate, they didn't just see motorcycles or antiques. They saw Frank's entire life, the journeys he had taken, the stories he had told, and the dreams he hadn't had the chance to fulfill. For those who loved him, it was an emotional and heartbreaking experience. They didn't just lose a friend, a loved one. They lost a guardian of history, someone who had spent his entire life searching for and protecting the stories of the past. However, the biggest surprise wasn't just Frank's antique collection, but how he chose to handle his legacy. According to Frank's will, all the proceeds from the auction of his collection would be donated to charitable organizations. This was a profoundly meaningful gesture, a final message from Frank to the world that he didn't just live for his own passion, but also wanted to turn his legacy into a great gift for the community. This decision made everyone reflect on who Frank was and the values he had upheld throughout his life. 4. Theories surrounding Frank Fritz's vast collection. After Frank Fritz passed away when his real estate doors were opened, people discovered not only his valuable collections of antiques and motorcycles, but also many strange details leading to various theories about the legacy he left behind. One of the most notable things was his massive collection of vintage motorcycles, including dozens of Harley-Davidsons, Indian motorcycles, and especially rare choppers. However, what was surprising was that some of the motorcycles in this collection were incomplete, with missing or unassembled parts. This has led to the theory that Frank might have hidden another part of the collection in a secret location, or he was in the process of restoring them to complete a treasure that he never got the chance to finish before he passed. Not only were there antique purchase documents, but there were also materials containing information about the secret places Frank had explored. Some handwritten letters from the 1920s to the 1950s suggested that Frank had discovered historically invaluable items in places like abandoned warehouses or old farms. One particularly special letter mentioned an item that Frank believed was not just an object, but a part of American history. However, he chose to keep this item secret and did not reveal it to anyone. Did this item truly exist? If it did, why did Frank keep silent about it? Was he afraid that it would fall into the wrong hands? Or did he want to preserve its historical value by preventing it from being commercialized? These questions only add to the mystery surrounding his legacy. Moreover, a bold theory suggests that Frank may have been a member of a secret collecting group, a community of antique enthusiasts operating entirely anonymously. Many believe that some of the items in Frank's collection, particularly the rare vintage signs and motorcycles, might have been traded in private transactions between renowned collectors. Old photographs of Frank, where he appears with famous collectors, but never publicly acknowledges these relationships, further reinforce this theory. A particularly special item, such as a 1915 Indian motorcycles sign, believed to be so rare that only a few people knew of its existence, indicates that Frank may have owned items that only people within the collector's circle could acquire through special relationships. Not only that, some people also believe that Frank's passion for collecting could be linked to a family legacy. Some documents found in his estate mention grandfather's motorcycles and the treasure in the back warehouse, leading many to speculate that Frank inherited part of the collection from his family and continued to develop it into the treasure we see today. Another intriguing factor is the relationship between Frank's legacy and his family. Although Frank rarely spoke about his family, some documents found in his estate suggest that his passion for collecting antiques could have been a family tradition. A handwritten letter found in his private home mentions grandfather's motorcycles and the treasure in the back warehouse. This further fuels the theory that Frank might have inherited part of the collection from his ancestors and then expanded it, transforming it into the massive treasure we see today. If this theory is correct, Frank's legacy is not only the story of a man living for his passion, but also the story of a family, about how a family preserved and passed on their love for history through each antique piece. Additionally, another detail that has sparked curiosity is that some items Frank proudly introduced on the show American Pickers were missing from auction listings after his death. For example, a special Harley-Davidson that Frank presented as a gem was absent from any inventory reports. This has led many to wonder, did Frank intentionally hide his most valuable items in a secret place, or did he give them to a close person or an organization he trusted? An unfinished will found in his estate complicates things further. In the will, Frank wrote, "Not everything can be sold. Some things need to be kept to tell the right story." This line suggests that part of Frank's legacy was not meant for commercial purposes, but to preserve and tell the historical stories he had spent his life protecting. The theories surrounding Frank Fritz's estate not only increase curiosity about his life and legacy, but also open up new perspectives on how he lived and contributed to the collecting community. Frank was not just a collector. He was also a storyteller, a protector of history, and perhaps the keeper of the greatest secrets in the collecting world. The items he left behind are not merely material possessions. They are pieces of a larger story. The story of a life lived for passion, overcoming challenges, and leaving behind mysteries that only time can unravel. Even after his death, Frank Fritz continues to make the world curious, admire, and endlessly question. Have we truly understood him, or does his legacy still hold untold secrets? 5. A meaningful legacy. The discoveries within Frank Fritz's estate are not merely a collection of antiques or rare motorcycles. They carry a deeper significance that goes beyond material value. For Frank's family and friends, these items are a poignant reminder of the man he was, of his tireless efforts to preserve history and share stories from the past. However, the meaning of these discoveries doesn't stop there. They also have a powerful impact on the community of antique enthusiasts, as well as on those who had never heard of Frank Fritz before. First, Frank's motorcycle collection has left many people in awe of its scale and value. Vintage motorcycles are not just means of transportation. They are symbols of a bygone era of endless journeys across the vast roads of America. The fact that Frank owned valuable motorcycles such as Indian motorcycles and Harley-Davidson shows that he was not just a collector, but an unofficial historian dedicating his life to preserving these cultural icons of the country. Experts in the motorcycle collecting community have called his collection a national treasure and believe it will become one of the most significant collections of vintage motorcycles ever discovered. However, for those close to Frank, this collection is not just a treasure trove. It is proof that Frank lived a life of meaning, a life he dedicated to pursuing his passion and protecting the values he cherished. To them, each motorcycle, each antique item carries a part of Frank's memory, of the journeys he took, the stories he told, and the way he lived his life with all his love and commitment. Moreover, other antique items in Frank's estate also offer profound insights into who he was. Vintage signs, artifacts from the past century, and even old toys are not merely material objects. They are pieces of a much larger story. The story of a man who spent his life seeking and preserving history. The fact that Frank spent many years collecting and restoring these items reflects not only his talent and persistence, but also his perspective on the world. For Frank, every object had value, not because of its monetary worth, but because of the story it carried. The discovery of Frank's legacy also reveals another aspect of his character, his generosity and open heart. His decision to donate the entire proceeds from the auction of his collection to charitable organizations deeply moved many people. This was not just a noble act, it was also a powerful statement about how Frank wanted to be remembered. He didn't just live for his passion. He wanted to share that passion with the community to turn his legacy into a meaningful gift for others. This act not only made those who loved him proud, but also inspired others to live lives of significance and service. The impact of these discoveries extends to the worldwide community of antique and vintage motorcycle enthusiasts. The story of Frank Fritz and his collection has become a source of inspiration, a reminder that collecting is not just about seeking and owning, but also about preserving and sharing. The items Frank left behind prove that their true value lies not in their material worth, but in the stories and memories they hold. Frank's story also reminds the community that preserving history is not the responsibility of just one person, but a shared mission for all of us. Finally, these discoveries bring to light a deeply moving yet profoundly meaningful truth. Although Frank Fritz's life has ended, his legacy will continue to live on. The items he left behind are not only a testament to his passion and dedication, but also a reminder that we should live lives of meaning, lives where we are ready to dedicate ourselves to the things we love and believe in. 6. Life lessons from Frank Fritz. The story of Frank Fritz's life and what was discovered in his possessions is not only an emotional historical record, but also contains profound lessons about passion, dedication, and the true value of heritage. For Frank, every item he collected was a symbol of a bygone era, a story worth telling. But beyond their material value, these legacies reflect how he lived, a life full of passion and kindness. Frank Fritz is a living testament to how following one's passion can transform an ordinary life into an extraordinary journey. Born not into wealth or favorable circumstances, he chose to live a life where his love for antiques and motorcycles was the driving force. The items he collected, from a classic Harley-Davidson to a weathered sign from the past century, all carry the mark of his affection and dedication. Frank didn't seek them solely for their financial worth. He sought them because of the stories they carried, the connection they provided to the past. The lesson here is passion not only helps us find joy in life, but it can also shape how we are remembered when we leave this world. Frank's life reminds us that instead of chasing short-term goals or societal pressures, we should take the time to discover what truly makes us feel alive. When we live with passion, the legacy we leave behind is not just material wealth, but also inspiration for others. One of the most remarkable things Frank Fritz did was recognizing the value in items that many others would overlook. A rusted beer can, an old helmet, or a toy from the 1950s. To Frank, all of these held stories worth cherishing. In a modern world where everything seems to revolve around speed and novelty, Frank taught us that those old, seemingly worthless things contain priceless lessons about history, culture, and humanity. This lesson extends not just to objects, but to how we perceive everything around us. There are small things in everyday life that we often ignore, but if we pay closer attention, they can hold deep meaning. Frank's lesson is to appreciate the small things, as they often carry greater value than we realize. Frank Fritz's legacy is not only in the antique items or the vast collection of motorcycles he left behind. His legacy also lies in how he used his life to preserve history and share his passion with the world. However, what makes his legacy especially unique is his decision to donate all the proceeds from auctioning off his collection to charity organizations. This is an act of great humanity, showing that Frank lived not just for himself, but wanted to use his legacy to make a difference in the lives of others. This act serves as a reminder that a legacy should not be measured by the material wealth we leave behind, but by the way we impact those around us. Frank Fritz left us a powerful lesson: how to use what we have to bring value to the community, turning what we love into a part of something greater. Frank Fritz's life was not always smooth sailing. He faced numerous challenges, from serious illnesses to the pressures of fame and personal conflicts. However, despite all these difficulties, he continued to passionately pursue his interests. Even after leaving the American Pickers show, he did not abandon his collecting work and still found ways to connect with the community through online platforms. Frank's story is a reminder that life isn't always easy, but if we remain steadfast in our beliefs and passions, we can overcome any obstacles. Success is not about never failing, but about the ability to get up after each fall. Frank Fritz was not only a collector, but also a storyteller. He didn't just collect antiques, he shared the stories behind them, connecting people with history and culture. This spirit not only made him a beloved figure on American Pickers, but also an inspiration for millions of antique lovers worldwide. The lesson from Frank is connection and sharing are the ways we create lasting value. The stories Frank told didn't just bring the past back to life, they also created new memories for the audience and the community. This serves as a reminder that no matter what we do, we should always look for ways to connect with others and share what we love. The story of Frank Fritz and the things discovered in his estate is a profound testament to the value of living with passion, respecting the past, and creating a meaningful legacy. Frank was not just an antique collector. He was a historian, an inspiration to those around him, and ultimately a man with a heart full of compassion. The items he left behind were not simply material possessions, but also carried stories, lessons, and cherished memories that will be preserved forever. Frank Fritz's legacy will continue to inspire generations to come, reminding us of the importance of preserving history, living for what we love, and doing good for the community. To Frank, each antique or motorcycle was not just an object. It was an essential part of his life, a life he lived with passion, dedication, and a deep respect for the past. And perhaps from what Frank Fritz has left behind, we should all ask ourselves, how are we living and what legacy do we want to leave for the world? If you are curious and want to explore more fascinating stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming videos. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.